This is SSN
Story Studio Network.
Hi, I'm Dean Gation, and this is the Powerful Connections Podcast. For over 40 years, I've been involved in planning and building high-voltage projects. My company, DGG5 Advising, is the opportunity maker you need for your energy and construction projects. My guests and I are going to share our experiences and how we have brought projects to successful completion. I'd like to introduce my guest today, Chris Benedetti. Chris is a partner at Sussex Strategy Group in Toronto. More specifically, he is very well versed and entrenched in the political matters in Ontario, the other provinces and territories in Canada. His understanding of policy-related matters is the best I know, and Sussex is the best at public affairs. Chris is great to talk with at any time and understands the pathways to commercialization in very heavily regulated environments. Sussex is the group you want to connect with for government relations and advisory services. He is also very well versed in stakeholders and rate holders issues that are affecting them. Chris, tell me a little bit about yourself and tell us about your focus and vision.
Sure. No, thank you very much, Dean. And that was quite the introduction. I really appreciate it. Maybe a little bit about myself. So I'm managing partner here at Sussex Strategy Group. To your introduction, we're a full service government affairs, strategic advisory and communications firm based here in Toronto, doing work across Canada in heavily regulated areas. And one of those areas that is very dominant has been for Sussex in the 25 years that we've been in operation, but very much a big fixture of discourse these days is one of energy and very much clean energy and clean energy infrastructure. And so that's something that I've had the opportunity to focus on for the last almost 2 decades, really across Canada, not just here in Ontario, but from coast to coast to coast. And obviously, it's a very exciting time now. It has been an exciting time for the last number of years. And to your point, I've been working with a number of different utilities, generators, rights holders, large-scale industrial customers, investors, and really have really enjoyed the opportunity to be on this journey towards creating cleaner and more resilient infrastructure across the country. My background, I worked in the federal government for a number of years back in the 1990s and really started consulting in the late 1990s when we were going through a period of market opening, market liberalization for energy, particularly power and utilities across North America. And so cut my teeth, as it were, on those heady years in terms of how you set up electricity markets and systems to attract private investors and build more modern electricity systems. And obviously have gone through the undulations of getting off coal-fired generation, building more clean energy infrastructure, and now what a lot of people refer to as energy transition and transformation.
Thanks, Chris. I think the big one of coal is definitely going to be a struggle for some of the provinces out east. For those listening, I first met Chris as we were finishing up what was a grid extension, first of its kind for Five Nations Energy along the Western James Bay coast back in 2001. And we've really rekindled since the early days by all the finishing up of the transmission line we did from Red Lake to Pekanjikam in northwestern Ontario, and the working on the planning and the response to the Wate project. I was involved in that. We had a group of Kiewit, SNC, and PowerTel. We weren't successful on it, but we had proven internally that our plan was good, and the lessons learned helped many other clients and projects since then. And we've been working on many projects where Chris is at the front end of a major project or a development, helping folks figure out their path. Mostly the access is, the impact of politics and policies on their efforts and their activities. And Chris is heavily sought out to provide feedback and advice to many groups, and being visible is a big part of it. And you will find Chris probably recently at many of the Energy Roundtable sessions that are in Toronto and Calgary. To all those, he is talking to everybody, and sometimes provides presentations or moderates discussions, but he's always got a line of people up wanting to talk to him between sessions. I'm not sure when he sleeps, but many of the items we get into in our discussions are assets, approvals, social license, that come up in these developments. And Chris, talk to us a little bit about the visibility and presence of Sussex and all of these things going on today.
It's certainly multifaceted. I mean, I think, Dean, to your point, the public interest in infrastructure is multifaceted. So on the one hand, energy is a foundational component of fueling our economy in many, many ways, right? So it's something that we need to power our homes, to heat our homes, to drive businesses. I mean, certainly in the last few years, what we've seen is that a lot of new investments, be it EV battery manufacturing or automation of logistics centers, or, the greening of steel making, it requires a lot of electricity. It requires a lot of energy. In a much more dynamic way than what we've seen previously. If you go back to the majority of the last 100 years, you could correlate energy demand with GDP growth. And for the longest period of time, planners, system operators, utilities really understood what different components of your manufacturing, heavy industries, extractive industries, what that meant in terms of energy. And they would plan based on what they knew. And what I think we've really seen over the course of the last few years has been a lot of disruption, not just in terms of what the technologies are, but also in terms of what and how people are consuming energy. And so, commonly we're hearing now about electrification, energy transition, moving to lower carbon intensity forms of energy. It feels very much like an all hands on deck issue. But it's not just about energy resiliency and driving a prosperous economy and how that, reflects in terms of your economic competitiveness. Great example in terms of attracting EV battery manufacturing. Why did they come to Ontario, Quebec, and not to places in the United States? Energy is a big facet of that. But it's also a big affordability concern these days. And so as affordability is at the forefront of the public discourse, it's what a lot of Canadians are talking about. Obviously, it's a lot of what governments are talking about too. And, I think that government becomes a very important part of the conversation. And of course, politics is a very important part of government because it's so value at stake for people, individuals, residents, but also businesses. And therefore, government feels a duty to not only be a steward, but also to be a leader in terms of what does that intersection between energy reliability, affordability, and sustainability look like. And obviously that has a big effect on what plans for energy systems are, electricity systems from province to province and nationally, but also what it means in terms of procurement, asset selection, how we're funding certain assets, what the inducement mechanisms are to invest in new assets. So government is very, very an important part of the equation. And obviously is a consultancy that sort of is focused on government and how these things translate into policy plans and procurements. We're very much at the epicenter of that. There's then, of course, the whole consideration of social license and building infrastructure in communities. How do the people that live in those communities interact with that infrastructure and how they are mindful about, the local acceptance or not of that infrastructure? That's a big part of building, I think, things in this country now that has always been there, but is probably a bit more acute than it used to be. And not just in terms of, how projects will interact with host communities, but what role do communities, and in particular Indigenous communities, play in actually making decisions and taking ownership positions and being partners in the projects that are being developed? So, it cuts across a lot of what government is involved in and obviously the politics behind some of these considerations. But certainly we get involved in a lot of those issues because they're all both opportunistic and risk factors of how you develop assets in this country.
I think, that the big thing that we've seen in the growth of the industry, your group in advising people and organizations the last 20 years, and, talk to us about what led you to be a leading strategy group.
So, when it goes back to when I started in the late 1990s, it happened to be the case that on the electricity side, a lot of provinces, and I'll pick on Ontario for a moment, was really looking at, how do we move to different forms of power production. Back in those days, we were also talking about energy transition, but whereas today it's usually in a context of GHG emissions and climate change, back then it was very much a conversation about the precursors to smog and human health conditions. But certainly if you go back to the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was a desire to shift energy production to different forms, cleaner forms of power production. There was also very much a question in terms of, can the public, through publicly owned utilities, still fund the infrastructure that's going to be required, or should governments rather be focused on crowding in private sector investors to build those assets and take the risk on those assets? And so I happen to be involved in the early stages of many of those discussions. And just as the system learned through the years, I think we all learned through the years through experience, what that relationship with local communities was like, with Indigenous communities. What were the essence of successful asset development from an environmental permitting and approval standpoint, but also in terms of the commercial structure of those things on, be it power generation, pipelines, or wires, and both distribution and high voltage transmission. And so I think over the course of many, many years, observing what was working well, what needed to be improved upon, and it continues to be a landscape that is, I think, learning and trying to perfect itself. I don't know if we'll ever get to that point of absolute perfection, but I think it's really about finding balance between a multiplicity of different imperatives. And again, back around the whole fundamental question of reliability, affordability, and sustainability. So it's been a journey. And I should say, too, it's quite interesting how the journey and the imperatives are very similar between a lot of different jurisdictions, but the twists and turns are often very particular to a particular province. So what has been the experience in British Columbia might be different than Alberta, might be different from Nunavut to Ontario to the Atlantic provinces. But fundamentally, it's a very physical system. So energy works the same way in British Columbia or, Nova Scotia as it does here in Ontario, but how we manage it and how we form it and how we regulate it and how we plan for it and procure will differ between different markets. So having a good understanding of that is very important.
I think the regional part of things is definitely going to come into play as we go along, because you're not only involved in energy, there's many facets you get into in environment, healthcare, natural resources, trade and transportation, et cetera. But, the Indigenous affairs and the land use items, there's just such a multifaceted thing happening that the fairness and transparency that is in the best interest of the public that occurs in policy and regulations and political activities. This is the manner in which the rate base is going to be dealt with. But you've talked about a number of things that are going on that have to be dealt with, and where does the rate deal with all these things? So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
Well, and Dean, to that point, I mean, I think that we're seeing in a lot of places that there's a balance between what do we expect the ratepayer, let's say at the electricity or the gas ratepayer, to pay for, and what are other things that we find acceptable for the tax base to pay for. And in a lot of different jurisdictions, there's been an intermingling of the two. So if you look at Ontario, for example, right now the Treasury of Ontario is paying about a third of all electricity costs, relieving that cost burden from ratepayers. And that's been purposely been done by the government through things like the Comprehensive Electricity Plan and the Ontario Electricity Relief Mechanism, because the government understands that Not only do we have to have a reliable energy system, but it has to be affordable. But there's also economic drivers. There's human health aspects in terms of the carbon intensity or the effects of your infrastructure on the ecosystem, the broader ecosystem, that shouldn't just be the responsibility of ratepayers, but also there's responsibility of taxpayers. And so I think that increasingly we're finding that the conversation is going to the whole fundamentals of, should infrastructure be wholly paid for in a traditional cost of service regulated utility fashion? Or are there certain costs that are actually civil infrastructure and costs that are just to be socialized across all of people? Why, if we build resilient infrastructure, if we think that that is a big foundational component of economic development and prosperity, why only cause that cost to be paid for by, let's say, 5 million ratepayers and not 15 million residents? And so these are some of the fundamental policy questions that I think are part and parcel of energy transition and energy transformation that governments of all stripes across the country are grappling with.
It's going to be interesting to see, this is probably the 407 discussion where there's an infrastructure built that's worth billions and billions, but it gets paid for over a user fee. So is the rate base got to look at not just the capital investment, but maybe just the user fee, and that the infrastructure development needs to come from infrastructure funds? So, all those discussions are going to be fun ones to have as time goes by, because everything's getting so expensive and everything's getting so big.
Yeah, and even in the last week, we've had the provincial government here in Ontario introduce table its fall economic statement. Part of that was the creation of a new Ontario infrastructure bank, and inclusive of what the scope of the OIB will be looking at energy infrastructure. So again, here is something that will be balanced between Treasury resources crowding in interest and activity from pension funds and others to help fund infrastructure that is serving a broader public purpose and not just on a typical kind of cost causality beneficiary pays basis. Mm-hmm. I think that if we look to building 1.5 million homes in Ontario, if we look to building out infrastructure in communities, earlier today I was actually listening to Peter Bethenfolly, who's our Minister of Finance here in Ontario, talk about a $185 billion infrastructure plan in the province over the next 10 years. A big part of that is energy. And so I think we really have to contemplate, how is that infrastructure going to be paid for? Who are the beneficiaries, recognizing that the beneficiaries are not just ratepayers, but society as a whole. And then how do you find balance in terms of, where those monies get committed and how they get committed, recognizing that it's not just a provincial treasury responsibility, but increasingly the federal treasury is getting involved in this as well.
Yeah. The interesting one will be the north of Ontario and Canada, where the issue is not just infrastructure. It's about getting rid of diesel and diesel generation and emissions and decarbonization and the saving of fuel and so forth. Where does that responsibility lie? And I don't know if it's in the ratepayer cost. So anyways, that'll be a neat one to keep talking about. Mm-hmm. Let's move on to a couple things I'd like to find out. Where do you feel at, beginning levels, high levels, that people or organizations or projects stumble, and where do you help them get these solutions to get through the initial planning stages?
So I think that, social license is a big one that we're seeing a lot of. And, almost every day now we're seeing articles around assets, be it, gas-fired generation, battery energy storage, transmission assets, where there's varied opinions in local communities that are playing host to those assets around the local social acceptance. I think that is something that we're living in a world increasingly where it's hard to build assets without having that cohesion and buy-in at a local level. And, that could be with a local municipality. It could be with an indigenous community. I think that, even in the 20 years that I've been doing this work, there is an acute awareness that it's not just something where you have to look at what the impact of groundwater or the impact on fish and fauna or wildlife or broader ecosystems, but I think it's also the impact on the social well-being of communities and how do you intertwine their interests with one of a project when quite often at the early stages of a project, you haven't fully formed what that project is going to look like. Either from a physical footprint standpoint, or even if you look at, say, for example, a transmission line, what the precise routing of that technology or that asset is going to be. I think it requires a lot more work upfront to involve people at a far earlier stage of development so that, you're not introducing a project to a community when it's really well formed, but you're really bringing in rights holders and you're bringing in local communities at a far earlier stage to have them involved in the fundamental formative periods of the project, what the project will look like, how it will be involved. And we're seeing a lot of great examples of this, to be honest, everything from, pump storage to different other kinds of technologies, and certainly on transmission infrastructure and whatnot. I think that a lot of developers are seeing that there's a lot of risk mitigation that can be done at the earlier stages of a project that aren't really all that costly, and it's better to bring people in and start to build partnerships and to understand the perspective of people to help that really shape what a project is going to look like. I think the other thing that we're seeing is obviously it's an economically volatile market when it comes to everything from supply of technology and equipment through to the supply of labor, high inflationary market. So building out a capital stack, with those kinds of volatilities, the wars going on overseas, the impact that has on global supply chains, it's tough. And if anything, it causes more time to take in terms of risk mitigating some of those things. But the reality, of course, is that we don't have more time. Increasingly, the feeling is that, in a lot of cases, we're behind the eight ball, and you need to organize and manifest these things so that we see assets coming into service a lot more quickly than not. And I'll maybe give you a great example. One of the projects that we're working on is the electrification of steel making up in Sault Ste. Marie, which is in northeastern Ontario. That exercise of transitioning from coke to use steel to electric arc furnaces, the actual building of the electric arc furnaces and the switching over, as it were, in terms of what goes on behind the fence line, can be done a lot faster than the years it takes to build out the electrical infrastructure required to actually get the electrons to the site to enable that to happen in a safe and reliable manner. So, if we're going to enable industries to grow and to do the kinds of things that they need to do to be economically resilient and competitive in the years ahead, we're going to need to build infrastructure faster. So how do you reconcile all the work that needs to be done up front with the reality that we need to build fast?
And that's the biggest dilemma we're having right now is how do we get a 3 or 4 year construction period to start sooner because the environmental period is longer than the construction period? And how do we get into some regional planning? How do we get into roads and utility corridors being done at the same time?
Yeah, and I think that's a great example of co-location of infrastructure and planning that I think is right on in terms of where there can be improvements. Already we've seen some improvements in terms of where leave to construct or environmental assessments can be streamlined, not necessarily for the purpose of cutting corners, but for the purpose of helping to move through the necessary work that has to be done in a more expedited or streamlined fashion, while all of the prudence is done in terms of making sure that you're building and planning for assets properly. And yeah, I think, my suspicion is that we're going to see a lot more work done in terms of how do we plan? How do we deem things to be prudent, and how do we do that in such a way that we're supportive of economic development and not stifling it? Another great example, while there is work now going on in the southwestern part of this province in terms of building out infrastructure to enable greenhouse expansions and new economic development activity down in the southwest part of this province, it was a long time that a lot of those greenhouses were really struggling to get adequate accessibility to electricity. And, I think that it was a great learning opportunity to say, okay, business moves at a pace that governments and regulators and system operators don't always move. Again, I go back to the comment around, for a good part of the 20th century, things just kind of happened and we knew how they were going to happen. And now things are happening in a very different way. So the system has to adapt to that. And we can't let the markets outpace what the systems and the regulators and governments can do, or else that's going to erode your economic competitiveness. We got to figure that piece out.
We're in a bit of a dilemma right now in that we have a lot of infrastructure that, probably was built just after the Second World War and it's at its end of life. And we're about to have the biggest infrastructure development since the Second World War. And, we want to double power by 2050 and triple by 2080 and the supply chain issues and so forth. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here for improvement. I think there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration, but we talk about the innovation that's coming. And I think that, in my experience in helping many high voltage developments, the evaluation of their cost and time and the waste they do spinning their wheels when they don't have a subject matter or advocate advisor in place, this is critical to starting a project. So I think, the biggest thing is you talked about discussions earlier, planning earlier, engagement earlier. And I think they've got to open up to what they want to do earlier to get people like yourself involved, to get them going quicker. I think people spin their wheels for a long time trying to figure out what they do, and they need to ask for help right away.
Yeah, I think it's a balance in terms of,
True.
What is going to be that conduit that I can see a commercial return on my investment, and what kind of security do I have that's going to be there for if I go and invest money? Am I going to be able to see a return on that investment in a prudent and stable way? And so, we live in a market here in Ontario, for example, where if we look at generation, all of that generation is pretty much contracted with the IESO. If we look at transmission facilities, they're all regulated by the Ontario Energy Board. But if you go to some other markets in the United States, or if you go to Alberta, you have a far greater degree of merchant assets and whatnot. And so, in those markets, people are taking higher risks with the opportunity to get a return. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I think that, again, it's taking lessons learned from what works in some places. How might we apply that to some of the markets here in Canada, and how can you make gains? It is an incremental. I honestly don't believe, Dean, that there's necessarily a silver bullet. And I think, though, that it's the responsibility of stakeholders to bring solutions to the table. And because governments across the country are so integral to the decision-making of how the markets and how the systems function, I really do think it's the obligation of the investors, of the stakeholders, of the utilities to think about what are good and reasonable solutions that meet public interest imperatives that you can bring to the table as experts and provide good counsel to government on how incremental changes that can be made that will produce better outcomes. And so we're fundamentally in that business. Obviously, we can't do it alone. It's very much working with our clients who are the experts in these things so that we can achieve the kind of objectives that I think are in everybody's best interests.
Many of these public infrastructure projects, have all of those decisions to make, and they've got a lot of risk review process to go to. And you talked about a duty of care in the things they're doing. And the strategic planning and strategic communications are, very big. And Sussex can help them navigate those complex issues. But how do you advise and support projects and organizations in those good decisions? Because the timely manner of those decisions is there, but they've got to have a bit of a care and control. I know how to build polls and put them in place, but what's the policies and regulations and standards that are applying to me? How do I manage those best?
So quite often we go through an exercise at the outset of any assignment where we think in a perfect world, from the investor standpoint or from the industrial customer standpoint, whomever is the active entity in question, what is the optimal kind of, what would you think is the best way to approach this from a social license standpoint, from a community acceptance standpoint, from a planning, from a procurement standpoint? And how does that compare to reality? Where are there gaps? Where do you think that there's red tape that can be addressed? Where do you think that there's efficiencies that can be sought? And sometimes the client doesn't have all of those answers, but we go through a bit of an exercise to think about where are those opportunities that you can see that there could be improvements made to what the status quo is. And then how do we interact with, be it regulators or system operators or governments, or local communities for that matter, to affect the kind of changes that we think are going to produce better outcomes. And, I should really say it's very rarely is it a one-sided kind of conversation where it's only government or its entities that need to change or adapt to change. Quite often it's the clients too that need to think about how do we do things that are better aligned with what outcomes the government is trying to affect, or that is better aligned with communities or better aligned with rights holders. How can we make better decisions to result in better projects, better infrastructure? And so it's very much an iterative process that we'll go through. And, what I find is that if you do that sort of strategic thinking about what is it that we're trying to solve for and what are we trying to accomplish, and what are the different means, be it through regulation or be it through statute or be it through policy or planning or procurement, that we can do some of those things, then you start kind of better understanding, okay, how and where am I going to focus my efforts on achieving some progressive change that is going to result in some better outcomes. And as I say, it's never a one size fits all kind of approach. For every community, for every rights holder, for every project, it's tailored. And like you mentioned, Wataynikaneyap Power, and, that's a project that I've had the opportunity and the privilege to work on for over a decade. We're also working on similar transmission projects to get off diesel generation in places like Nunavut and the Yukon. And while there's lessons that we can learn, adapting an approach for the local environments and certainly for the political realities and policy realities that are in a place, be it the Yukon or Nunavut or Northern Alberta or Ontario, wherever it might be, is always very customized and very tailored. So you need to be adaptable and flexible to change and really being thoughtful in terms of how you're doing your work.
I know about adaptable and being ready. We were in the launch of the transmission line at Pikanchikam a few years ago, and we received a verbal award from the owner, and they told us we needed to be in Thunder Bay the next day and get on a charter flight to be in the community the following day to go through meeting chief and council, meet the elders, visit a training course that we had organized, then do a public session of questions and answers, and then come back and review. And what blew me away was, we were ready for that. But what blew me away was the day we were there, the Sussex video crew was there to catch all the action. That was pretty cool. Did interviews, did promotional items. The video production that you did was outstanding. And so having those services is pretty neat to record these things.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you, Dean, one of the reasons why on that particular project we thought that approach was going to be so important is because In that particular instance, we're talking about remote communities, in northwestern Ontario, and when you think about politicians or policymakers at Queen's Park or on Parliament Hill, unfortunately, very, very, very few of them have been to a remote community, a fly-in community. And so, when we were talking about that particular project, we weren't just talking about energy and infrastructure. We were talking about housing, and we were talking about businesses, and we were talking about drinking water, and we were talking about, climate resilience, and we were talking about a lot of different things that visually were we thought very important to show to people, to educate people. And words are one thing, but if you could show people through video or different tools what it's actually like in some of those communities and what the object or the purpose of the project was, it wasn't a transmission project in and of itself. It was an economic prosperity project that is going to change those communities for generations to come. It's really transformative change. And using different means of communication so that you are really helping to build knowledge, and through knowledge and understanding of what the purpose of a project is. And so that's something that we're always struggling to do. And quite frankly, that it could be a project in a remote setting, or it could be a project in high density urban area in downtown Toronto. Never assume that everybody knows what you're talking about, and really take the time to bring people into a project so that they really truly understand what it's all about. Not just the technical gobbledygook, which is always very, very important, but it's really important for people to understand purpose and place and context. And those are all things that we really try and do.
The things that have to be maneuvered through, we look at consultation and routing selection, economic development, employment, and this, the structuring those items starts with a good vision and direction of strategy, but there's so much to maneuver through, and we've talked about all of that in the start of a development. So those are great items that get brought out. So I'm going to bring us to an item of one of my favorite words that's been coming up, and that's certainty. We talked about it last episode with Mark Rose from Morrison Hirschfield, and I talk about it all the time with Pat Chilton, and that CEO of Five Nations Energy, and it's about the importance of the Indigenous involvement and the political certainty of a project. And I feel this describes many items of the Indigenous situations today, and certainly, de-risks a project if there is good communication and involvement of leadership and elders and members of the community, the tribal councils, the organizations. And they've always had good success with communicating with community leaders and members to know what a project's about. That's been a lot of things, and my efforts have always been focused on the concerns and issues from a technical standpoint. But we covered a lot of those things in environmental with Mark last episode. But before there's any field activities, we need to understand all the items of the direction of the agencies involved in studying, planning, and creating policy. So tell us how you focus and deal with these items to advise Indigenous groups or organizations working with Indigenous groups on what you've got to do before you start thinking you're going to be boots on the ground.
Well, and I'll say, Dean, that if I go back to projects that I was working on 20 years ago, we used to use a word of accommodation. Mm-hmm. And the theory at the time was a project will have impacts. Typically, back in those days, it was commonly viewed that the impacts were on traditional rights that communities might have, and access to things like hunting and fishing. And that, the accommodation comes from the concept that, one has to accommodate for the impacts that the project will have with the local community. And usually those accommodations were, financial in some way, shape, or form. We don't see that anymore. What we really see now is a real conversation about partnerships. And, I think it's still the case that a lot of people will out of the gate approach it as almost a compliance issue. I want to understand the duty to consult. What does that entail? What is the impact on the impact assessment agency and UN DRIP and all of these various things that are kind of legal concepts. And what we really try to steer people towards is look at this as a partnership and look at the opportunities that can be produced by not only working with rights holders, but really what rights holders can bring to the table as decision makers, as guides, as counselors, as experts, as service providers. And so, a lot of very successful projects now are done on the basis of, working with communities and absolutely, there is the rigorous environmental approvals and permitting and all the work that has to go into developing projects. But there's also, how do we do that in close relationships and often with the economic participation of rights holders? And, how can that be formed? And so, we see now things like Hydro One, which is a large transmitter here in Ontario, come out with their First Nations equity participation model, where, Indigenous communities will have an opportunity to participate up to 50% of the equity on a project for new greenfield projects over $100 million in size. We're seeing other opportunities, be it pump storage projects or battery energy storage projects, the existing procurement that the ISO is doing, which gives added points priority to projects that have Indigenous economic participation. You really get the sense that it's not just about a pathway of permitting and approvals around a legalistic compliance question, but it's really a question about how do I work on forming, planning, and then developing a project so that I'm doing that in conjunction with the rights holders and the communities that are being affected by it. I think it's wonderful. And I think at the end of the day, you see a lot more successful projects that are really intertwined with what a community's interests are, what their needs are. I think it's a very exciting development.
We're working right at this moment with Hydro One's Indigenous Relation Unit to help develop an Indigenous services agreement to bring the services to the communities that are going to be involved as owners, where they don't have the knowledge or the whereabouts or what to do. And we're going to bring them that advocacy, but on behalf of and with Hydro One to create these projects, because Hydro One's the technical person and the asset owner and the transmitter, and they're going to create these new transmission companies. And we've got kind of a level 1 is ministerial amendments to transmitter license, 2 is ownership, 3 is going to be planning, strategy, and development. And, I think it's going to be very critical where we're going to see yourselves and others and myself doing some of this and this innovation in the new future that's coming. I think it's going to be very interesting. So how do you see us doing more things and more items in decision-making for these, and what's the balance of these to get to your favorite words, the reliability, effectiveness, and sustainability?
Well, I think it's planning sooner. I mean, if you go back, and again, I'm looking predominantly on the Ontario context, but this could be said about most jurisdictions. Even Quebec, Hydro-Quebec last week came out with an updated plan that has them building a lot of infrastructure over the next 10 years, 15 years to accommodate the kind of growth that they see in their market. Here in Ontario, back in July, the Energy Minister, Todd Smith, released Powering Ontario's Growth that talks about a lot of infrastructure that's going to be needed in this province, be it generation, storage, transmission. And it's still only a small part of that which was outlined in Pathways to Decarbonization, which was a report that came out in 2020, late 2021, almost 2 years ago now, from the IESO. And so, I think the moral of the story, if I can put it that way, is that we're going to need a lot of stuff, and we're going to need it a lot faster than what we've how we've developed it in the past. And we're going to need to think about where we draw the lines of prudency. I think we need to be a lot more accepting of taking on risk, appreciating that risk is often borne by the ratepayer? How do we manage that in a reasonable and effective way? What is the responsibility of the state to help induce investment in certain things? And you can see that through the creation of entities like the Ontario Infrastructure Bank. But I think, Dean, it really comes down to we need to better understand where we need the puck to go in the future. What does the net exactly look like? How far out is the net? How big is the net? And, we need to get that puck moving, because if we don't, we're going to fall behind.
Because we're back where we were in the 90s, where we made a decision that we thought would just fit the bill for the next 20 or 30 years. And now here we are and we're going, oh, we need to make a new decision. Wasn't wrong at the time, but we've got new information and new requests and new demands and new situations and just new decisions to be made.
And I think that it's our electricity system was built on the fundamental sort of construct that we produce electrons far off somewhere. Mm-hmm. You transport that across high voltage wires. Those are step down, until the point that we consume them at the distribution level in our homes or in our businesses. And there's another facet to this as well, because obviously that is going to continue to be a big part of our energy system, be it nuclear assets, hydroelectric assets, renewable assets, gas assets, geothermal, what biomass. There's going to continue to be a lot of that out there. But I think now the technology is such that we can do a lot of very interesting things at the distribution level as well. Yeah. So grid modernization, two-way flow, DSOs, distribution system operators, enabling distribution-enabled resources, or DERs. DERMS. In the electricity sector, we love our acronyms. So there's all sorts of work that I think has been done, but really needs to be done in terms of how do we unlock things at the distribution level, which traditionally we didn't really count a lot of value in, because from a bulk system standpoint, you couldn't see it. And if you couldn't see it, you couldn't control it. So when we talk about grid modernization, it's about how do we see more things than we ever have before using technology? How do we control more things than we ever have before through technology, all the way through to our homes and electric vehicles, all the way up to, the 300-400 megawatt loads that we're going to have at the bulk system? And how do we manage and plan for that better? And really, I think it's, Dean, very exciting, because we're truly just on the cusp of it, but it's going to happen. It's not up to governments. The marketplace is affecting this kind of change. And now the regulators and governments and everybody else has to keep up. The supply chain has to keep up. Capital needs to keep up. So, I think it feels like we're at the beginning of something, but we're at the beginning of something that is going to have impact for many, many years to come. It's very exciting.
Many years. One of the things I'm going to talk about later, I've got some of the manufacturers and suppliers are talking about, we've got all this demand, and how are we going to deliver? And their look and view of how they're going to deliver and how we're going to manage equipment and delivery of stuff, and how you're going to have to look at it sooner and earlier and maybe pre-order stuff. And so there's going to be a lot of fun in that discussion as well. So I'm going to get to getting out to the closing. We're getting close to the end of our time. Any last closing words before we say goodbye?
No, Dean, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on, and obviously it's very exciting to talk about all these things. And, as I say, that we're at the cusp. I think that there's always consideration about political change, and governments obviously change. They come and go. But, I think a lot of the themes that we talk about are enduring around reliability, affordability, and sustainability. If we go to Europe, or if we go to the United States or Asia or here in Canada, policymakers are talking about the same things. And so, really, it's how do we pool our talents and experience and understanding of these things to come up with better pathways to achieve these kinds of objectives. And I think it's going to be based on doing that together. And as I said earlier, there's no silver bullet. It's an all hands on deck approach. And I'm really excited to see what might come of it. So really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Chris, for joining us and bringing us such a great insight into the political atmosphere and the policy matters that people have to understand and deal with. In my next episode, we're going to discuss planning with Lloyd Gurman from Enterprise Canada. This will be an interesting one. It goes back many years. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening to this episode of Powerful Connections. Get in touch with me on my website at dgg5advising.com or find me on LinkedIn at Dean G. Gation. See you on the next episode.